day the Viltrumite arrived in Chicago, the city did not end quietly. It ended in a single afternoon, block by block, with the sound of a man in a red and black cape tearing through a skyscraper the way a child tears through wet paper. Nolan Grayson had spent 40 years on this planet building a reputation so airtight that even the most powerful heroes trusted him with their lives, which made it so much easier when he ended those lives in a single room, with his bare hands, without breaking a sweat. He had a plan. He had always had a plan. Earth was to be softened, broken, and delivered to the Viltrumite Empire on a schedule that had been set centuries before Nolan ever touched down in this solar system. And as he stood in the burning wreckage of what used to be the guardians of the globe, surrounded by bodies and silence, he was completely certain that nothing left on this planet could stop what was already in motion. He was wrong, not because a government deployed something new, not because a secret weapon had been waiting, but because somewhere in the smoke and the falling concrete, a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit had wandered into the disaster zone looking for a grocery store that wasn't on fire. And when he saw the cape and the carnage, he didn't run, didn't call for backup, didn't even look particularly surprised. He just tilted his head slightly, put his hands in his pockets, and asked if the guy in the cape was the one who knocked over all the buildings. That question, casual, unbothered, almost bored, was the first crack in something Nolan Grayson had never once considered fragile. And before this was over, that crack would swallow everything. If you think Omni-Man just met someone he can intimidate, you haven't been paying attention. Subscribe now, because what happens next isn't a fight. It's the moment a conqueror realizes the universe has something it never bothered to explain to him. The fires in Chicago had been burning for 3 hours by the time Saitama found the intersection. He had not come to Chicago for any particular reason related to heroism or emergency response. He had seen a flyer in his apartment building back in City Z, something about a specialty discount grocery chain that had recently opened a location near downtown Chicago. And since monster activity had been slow for the past 2 weeks and his refrigerator contained nothing except a single egg and a packet of instant noodles, he had decided the trip was worth making. He had taken a bus most of the way, transferred twice, and then walked the last several kilometers because the transit system had stopped running in the direction of the smoke. This was not unusual in his experience. Smoke and stopped trains tended to go together. What he found when he reached the outer edge of the disaster zone was not a monster. There were no giant claws, no bioorganic screeching, no trail of acid burns or energy craters that he could trace back to something he was professionally obligated to punch. What there was instead was a man floating approximately 40 meters above street level, wearing a red and black cape, holding another man by the throat in a way that suggested the second man had recently been launched through at least 2 of the surrounding buildings. Saitama looked up, squinted against the sun, and assessed the situation with the particular brand of mild curiosity he applied to most things that did not involve dinner. The floating man was clearly the one doing the damage. The one being held looked like he was trying very hard to be somewhere else. Saitama put his hands in his pockets and watched for a moment, trying to determine if this was a hero fight, a villain fight, or one of those complicated situations where both people thought they were the hero, and he would have to read the atmosphere carefully before getting involved. Omni-Man dropped Mark, not gently. Mark Grayson hit a delivery truck at speed, crumpled the roof inward, and slid into the gutter trailing blood and pieces of his costume. Nolan descended slowly, deliberately, the way someone descends when they want the person on the ground to have enough time to fully understand what is about to happen to them. He landed 10 meters from his son, and the pavement cracked under his boots with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this to planets. He began to speak, the long Viltrumite speech, the one about strength and survival and the inevitable direction of history. And Saitama, standing at the edge of the rubble with his grocery bag still looped over one wrist, called out from across the street and asked if either of them knew whether the discount grocery chain was still open, or if the emergency services had closed off that block too. Nolan stopped speaking. He turned. He looked at the man in the yellow jumpsuit the way a person looks at something that has just said something structurally impossible, like a fire that has decided to be cold. Saitama met his gaze without any particular expression, waiting for an answer. Nolan had spent 40 years learning to read human beings, their fear, their posturing, their desperate attempts to project confidence they did not have, and the man standing across the rubble projected absolutely none of those things. He projected nothing. He was waiting for grocery store directions with the same energy that a person waits for a bus, and something about that complete absence of reaction made Nolan's next sentence die before it reached his mouth. Mark pulled himself out of the crushed delivery truck, spitting blood, and looked across the street at the bald man. He did not know who this was. He had never seen this person in any briefing, any hero registry, any file his father had ever mentioned. He was not armored. He was not broadcasting any energy signature that Mark's battered senses could detect. He was just standing there, and somehow that was the most unsettling thing Mark had witnessed in a day that had already included watching his father kill the guardians of the globe. Nolan found his voice and told the man to leave. The tone he used was the one that had ended arguments with heads of state and made trained soldiers step back without being asked. Saitama looked at him for a moment, then looked at Mark, then looked back at Nolan and said that the guy on the ground looked pretty badly hurt, and asked if Nolan was the one who did that, because if so, that seemed like kind of a problem. Nolan Grayson had not been challenged by a human being in 40 years. Not genuinely. There had been heroes who tried, men and women in capes and armor who had trained their entire lives and pointed everything they had in his direction, and every single one of them had lasted approximately as long as it took him to decide he was done being patient. The human body, regardless of enhancement, regardless of technology or determination or sheer force of will, was a temporary thing that broke along predictable lines when a Viltrumite decided it was time. Nolan knew exactly how much force it took to end a human life, the way a carpenter knows exactly how much pressure splits a particular type of wood. It was not cruelty, it was calibration. And when he turned his full attention toward the bald man in the yellow jumpsuit and told him, with complete finality, that he was going to walk away right now or he was not going to walk away at all, he was already calculating exactly how much force would be necessary and where to apply it. Saitama did not walk away. He also did not assume a fighting stance, did not charge up, did not broadcast any of the usual signals that told Nolan a confrontation was about to begin. He just looked at the kid bleeding in the gutter and said that someone should probably do something about that, and then looked back at Nolan with an expression of mild, patient displeasure, the kind a person wears when they are waiting for someone to stop being unreasonable so everyone can move on with their day. Nolan crossed the distance between them in just under a quarter of a second. At that speed, a human being does not perceive movement. They perceive a blur, then impact, then nothing. Nolan's fist connected with Saitama's face with enough force to have leveled a city block, enough force to have shattered reinforced steel plating, enough force that the shockwave alone cracked every remaining window on the street behind them and flipped the crushed delivery truck onto its side. Saitama's head moved approximately 2 centimeters to the left. He blinked. Then he turned back to face Nolan with the same expression he had been wearing before, slightly more focused now, the way a person looks when something mildly unexpected has happened but has not yet risen to the level of interesting. Nolan stared at him. The fist that had just struck this man was the same fist that had punched through the chest cavity of a Viltrumite warrior 3 centuries his senior. The math did not resolve. Nolan hit him again, faster, putting his full body weight and 40 years of Viltrumite combat training behind a strike aimed directly at the jaw, and the result was the same. A small movement, a blink, continued eye contact. Mark watched from the gutter with one hand pressed against a rib that had cracked in at least 2 places and tried to understand what he was seeing. His father did not miss. His father did not fail to cause damage. His father was the single most physically powerful being Mark had ever encountered, including everything Cecil had ever shown him in classified briefings. And whatever this person was, his father's strikes were landing and doing nothing, which meant either the man in the yellow jumpsuit was absorbing the force somewhere Mark couldn't see, or the force simply was not enough. And both of those options made the blood drain from Mark's face faster than his injuries already were. Nolan stepped back, not far, not in retreat, but back, the way a strategist steps back to reassess when the first approach has produced unexpected data. He looked at Saitama with a different kind of attention now, not the dismissive scan he applied to obstacles, but the careful, narrowed evaluation he reserved for things that had survived contact with him. Saitama, for his part, reached up and touched the side of his face where the second punch had landed, not because it hurt, but the way someone touches their cheek when they are trying to remember if they left the stove on. He said, almost to himself, that the guy hit pretty hard, which was technically true in the same way that the sun is technically warm. Then he looked at Nolan and asked, with complete sincerity, if this was what passed for a serious fight around here, because, if so, he had been hopping for something a little more engaging. The silence that followed that sentence was the kind of silence that precedes a fundamental restructuring of someone's understanding of the world. Nolan had heard humans beg. He had heard them threaten. He had heard them try to negotiate and posture and scream defiance in the final seconds before those seconds ran out. He had never heard one sound bored. He did not have a response for boredom. His entire framework for controlling a situation, for establishing dominance through demonstrated capability, assumed that the other party understood the stakes of being in his presence. Saitama did not appear to understand the stakes. More accurately, Saitama appeared to understand them perfectly and simply not care, which was so far outside every psychological and tactical model Nolan carried that, for the first time in 4 decades, Nolan Grayson did not know what to do next. Cecil Stedman had seen a lot of things in his career that defied easy categorization. He had seen men survive things that should have killed them, had seen technology do things that physics professors insisted were impossible, had seen the classified files on exactly what Omni-Man was and what he was capable of, and he had read those files with the cold, managerial calm of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the upper limits of what the universe could produce. He had contingency plans for Omni-Man. He had contingency plans for the contingency plans. He had spent years quietly building fail-safes and fallback positions and last resort options, specifically because he had always known, on some level, that the most dangerous thing on Earth was the thing everyone else believed was protecting them. What Cecil did not have, and had never considered building, was a contingency plan for a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit who appeared to have absorbed 2 direct strikes from Omni-Man and responded by asking for grocery store directions. The drone footage arrived at the Global Defense Agency's Operations Center 47 minutes after the first impact. The analyst who reviewed it watched the relevant 12 seconds 3 times before forwarding it up the chain with a note that said simply, "Review immediately, classification unknown." By the time it reached Cecil's desk, it had been watched 11 times by 6 different people, and not one of them had produced an explanation that survived contact with the next person in the chain. Cecil watched it once, all the way through, without expression. Then he watched it again. Then he pulled up every database the GDA maintained on enhanced individuals, unregistered superhumans, alien contacts, dimensional anomalies, and individuals flagged for observation but not yet classified, and he ran the face through all of them simultaneously. The search returned 0 matches. The man in the yellow jumpsuit did not exist in any system Cecil controlled, which meant he was either deliberately hidden or had simply never been noticed by anyone with the resources to notice things, and both of those answers were, in their own separate ways, deeply alarming. He called a room. Not a large room. Cecil did not believe in large rooms for sensitive information, but the specific room with the specific people who had security clearances high enough that he could speak plainly without spending 20 minutes managing what they were allowed to know. He put the footage on the screen, played the 12 seconds, and let it sit in the silence for a moment before speaking. He said that Omni-Man had struck an unregistered individual twice at full combat velocity, that neither strike had produced visible injury or behavioral change in the target, and that the target's subsequent response had been conversational rather than combative. One of the analysts asked if the footage had been tampered with. Cecil said that was the wrong question. The right question was what kind of being absorbed Omni-Man's full force and became mildly curious rather than dead, and whether that being was currently allied with Omni-Man, opposed to Omni-Man, or, and this was the option that kept Cecil's voice carefully flat, simply present by coincidence, and therefore aligned with no one and nothing, which made predicting behavior essentially impossible. The room did not have a good answer. What the room had instead was a growing awareness that the situation in Chicago had just added a variable that none of their existing models had a slot for. Omni-Man was a known quantity. A catastrophic one, yes, a civilizational threat that Cecil had been quietly preparing for since the day he first read the Viltrumite intelligence files, but known things could be planned against. The man in the yellow jumpsuit was not known. And what the footage showed was not a powered individual operating within any recognizable framework of enhanced human capability. It showed something else entirely, something that had no classification yet, because no one had ever needed the classification before. And the longer Cecil stared at the paused frame of that bald, utterly unbothered face, the more certain he became that whatever category they eventually created for this person, it was going to require them to throw out several assumptions they had previously treated as permanent. He assigned a full surveillance team to locate and observe the individual. He also, quietly, sent a separate communication to a separate contact, someone outside the GDA's official structure, someone who specialized in exactly the kind of problem that official structures were not built to handle. The communication was brief. It contained the 12 seconds of footage and 4 words. Find out what this is. He did not say please. Cecil Stedman had not said please in a professional context since 1987, and he was not about to start now just because the world had gotten strange again. Though he was willing to admit, staring at that paused frame, that this particular flavor of strange was new. Chicago had not stopped burning. The fires that Omni-Man's initial assault had started in the northern districts were still working their way through blocks of residential buildings, and the emergency services that had been dispatched to contain them kept getting redirected because new damage kept appearing in new locations, because Nolan Grayson was not done and had not planned to be done for some time yet. He had a schedule. The softening of Earth's defenses required a specific sequence of actions, and while the unexpected appearance of the man in the yellow jumpsuit had introduced a delay that Nolan was still processing, a delay was not a derailment. He had fought across star systems. He had outlasted civilizations. One unresponsive human, however inexplicably durable, was not going to rewrite 40 years of careful preparation. He told himself this with the particular firmness of someone who is telling themselves something, because the alternative requires a much longer conversation that he does not currently have time for. Saitama had not left. This was the part that Nolan kept returning to as he moved through the city, because every human being with any instinct for self-preservation had evacuated the immediate area within the first 20 minutes, and the ones who had not evacuated were either emergency personnel pinned down by debris or journalists pointing cameras from distances they clearly hoped were safe. Saitama was none of these things. He had followed Nolan at a walking pace through 3 city blocks, not aggressively, not tactically, but with the persistent, mildly interested energy of someone who has decided that the thing in front of them is more entertaining than going home, and he kept asking questions. Not strategic questions, Not the kind of questions a trained combatant asks to assess an opponent's capabilities. Questions like whether the cape was functional or purely aesthetic, and whether hitting buildings on purpose was a Viltrumite cultural practice, or just something this particular one did, and whether Mark, who was limping along behind both of them pressing his broken ribs together with one hand, needed to sit down somewhere, because he looked like he probably needed to sit down somewhere. Mark did not sit down. Mark watched the dynamic between his father and this stranger with an escalating sense of unreality that was competing aggressively with the pain from his ribs for his full attention. He had grown up watching his father move through the world with absolute authority, the kind of authority that did not require raising its voice, because the alternative to compliance was so clearly catastrophic that no one ever seriously considered it. And Saitama was not complying, but not in the way that a defiant hero doesn't comply, not with clenched fists and a speech about protecting the innocent. He was not complying the way a person doesn't comply with weather. He was simply present and unbothered, and his presence was doing something to his father that Mark had never seen anything do before. Nolan kept glancing back at him. Small glances, controlled, the kind a person makes when they are trying to assess something without appearing to assess it, and each glance lasted a fraction of a second longer than the one before it. Nolan decided to test the ceiling. He had been operating below his full capacity since the initial exchange because full capacity in an urban environment produced collateral damage on a scale that complicated his timeline. But the situation now called for data, and data required input. He turned, mid-stride, and threw a punch that he had previously used to crack the tectonic plate of a planet whose inhabitants had resisted Viltrumite colonization for 6 years. The shockwave alone stripped the facades off 4 adjacent buildings and sent every loose object within 200 meters into the air simultaneously. Saitama rocked back on his heels slightly, the way a person rocks back when a strong wind catches them off guard, and then rocked forward again. He looked at the 4 defaced buildings with something approaching mild concern, not for himself, but in the general direction of anyone who might have still been inside them. And then he turned back to Nolan and said that he was going to have to ask him to stop doing that in a neighborhood, because people lived here. The rescue teams 3 blocks east heard the shockwave and assumed a gas main had exploded. The GDA surveillance drone that had been tracking Saitama since Cecil's order went out 40 minutes earlier captured all of it in high resolution and transmitted it back to the operations center in real time, where the analyst on duty watched a man absorb a tectonic-level strike and respond by expressing concern for bystanders, and then typed a single line into the incident log before forwarding it up the chain. Previous classification insufficient. Recommend immediate escalation to tier unknown. It was the first time in the GDA's history that anyone had used the phrase tier unknown. The category had not existed before that moment. Cecil read the log entry, read it again, and then did something that the people who worked for him would later describe as the most alarming thing they had ever witnessed in a professional context. He sat very still for almost 30 seconds and said nothing at all. The emergency session convened at 4 in the morning in a room that officially did not exist inside a building that officially served a different purpose entirely. There were 9 people present. Not 9 departments, not 9 agencies, 9 individual human beings who between them controlled the response architecture of the most powerful government on the planet. And every single one of them had been pulled from sleep or dinner, or whatever quiet corner of normalcy they had been occupying when the secure line activated, and told them that the situation in Chicago had produced something that required their physical presence in a room with no recording devices before sunrise. They arrived looking like people who had been told something impossible over the phone and had spent the drive over trying to find a version of it that wasn't. None of them had found one. Cecil ran the briefing himself. He did not use softening language. He did not build toward the conclusion gradually or frame the information in ways designed to make it easier to absorb, because he had learned over a very long career that, when the information was genuinely unprecedented, the most efficient thing to do was put it directly in front of the people who needed to act on it, and let them have their reaction quickly so they could move on to being useful. He played the drone footage. All of it, not just the 12 seconds he had originally reviewed, but the full 93 minutes of footage that the surveillance team had compiled since the initial contact, which included 3 additional full-force strikes from Omni-Man, 2 of which had been clearly escalatory, and 1 of which had been, based on the trajectory and force calculation their physics team had run overnight, something that should have produced a crater. What it had produced instead was a man who tilted his head slightly and told Omni-Man that he was going to put a dent in his jumpsuit if he kept doing that, and then looked mildly annoyed about the jumpsuit specifically. The room had its reaction. Cecil let them have it for approximately 90 seconds and then moved on. He laid out what they knew, which was limited: male, adult, human in appearance, no detectable energy signature, no registered identity in any domestic or allied database, no known affiliation, no apparent agenda. He laid out what they did not know, which was extensive and included essentially every question that mattered: origin, motivation, upper limit of physical resilience, whether the resilience was absolute or merely extremely high, and most critically, whether this individual's continued presence in the Chicago situation was going to help or complicate their existing problem, which was still, above everything else, Omni-Man. One of the 9 asked whether the unknown individual could potentially be used as a weapon against Omni-Man. Cecil said that was the second wrong question in 2 days and explained why. You did not use things you could not control, and nothing about the footage suggested this person was controllable in any meaningful operational sense. He was not responding to threat. He was not responding to authority. He was responding, as far as Cecil could determine, entirely to his own internal logic, which appeared to involve mild curiosity and a preference that people not damage residential neighborhoods, and you could not build a tactical deployment around mild curiosity. What they decided, after 2 hours of discussion that kept circling back to the same absence of good options, was a layered approach that Cecil privately assessed as inadequate, but approved anyway, because inadequate was better than nothing, and nothing was the only alternative currently on the table. The military would establish a perimeter around the active conflict zone, not to contain Omni-Man, because they had run those numbers, and the numbers were not encouraging, but to manage civilian evacuation and document everything that happened inside the perimeter with every sensor they had available. A diplomatic contact would be attempted with the unknown individual, low-key, non-threatening, someone who could approach without triggering a defensive response, and ask the simple questions that the footage hadn't answered. And Cecil would personally reach out to the one resource he had been holding in reserve since the moment he first read the Viltrumite files. A resource that was expensive, unpredictable, and came with significant political complications, but which was currently the only thing on his list that had a theoretical chance of surviving direct engagement with Omni-Man long enough to matter. The diplomatic contact went badly, though not in the way anyone anticipated. The agent Cecil sent was good, experienced, calm, trained in first contact protocols developed for exactly this kind of unclassified enhanced individual situation. She found Saitama 3 blocks from the active damage zone, sitting on a fire hydrant eating a convenience store onigiri he had apparently located despite the emergency, and she introduced herself with the carefully calibrated neutrality of someone who had practiced this exact type of approach. Saitama listened to her politely, finished the onigiri, and said that he appreciated her coming over but that he was not really affiliated with any organization and was mostly just there because things kept happening, and it seemed rude to walk away while someone was clearly causing problems for people who lived in the area. He asked if she knew whether the discount grocery chain on Michigan Avenue was still structurally sound. She did not know. He thanked her anyway and stood up, because somewhere to the north a sound had just occurred that even Saitama's relaxed threat assessment registered as worth investigating. And the sound had come from the direction where he had last seen the man with the broken ribs trying not to fall over. The Viltrumite ship did not announce itself. It did not decelerate through the atmosphere on a visible trajectory, or produce the kind of entry signature that Earth's orbital monitoring systems were calibrated to detect, because it was not built to be detected by systems as primitive as the ones currently pointed at the sky above this planet. It entered low orbit at a velocity that should have produced a visible plasma trail, and did not, because the technology suppressing that trail was several hundred years ahead of anything Earth had developed or stolen or reverse-engineered from prior contact, and it held position above the cloud layer for 4 minutes and 17 seconds before anyone on the ground knew it was there. The first indication the GDA had of its presence was not a sensor reading. It was a communication, delivered on a frequency that no Earth technology was currently broadcasting on, which meant the message was not intended to be received so much as it was intended to be found, eventually, by whoever was paying enough attention to look in the right place. Cecil found it. He had people whose entire professional function was listening to frequencies that nothing should be broadcasting on, and when the signal came in they had it on his desk in under 8 minutes, decoded and translated by a system that had been built specifically for Viltrumite linguistic patterns using intelligence gathered over years of quiet, careful work that Nolan Grayson had never known was happening. The message was short. It said that the Viltrumite Empire was aware of an anomaly present in the current operational theater on Earth. It said that the anomaly had been flagged by long-range observation and that its nature was under assessment. It said that the Empire's operational timeline for Earth would not be delayed by an unclassified variable, and that if the anomaly proved to be a threat to Imperial interests, appropriate measures would be taken. It did not specify what appropriate measures looked like. It did not need to. Cecil read the message twice, noted the phrase unclassified variable with the grim recognition of someone who had used that exact phrase himself less than 24 hours ago, and understood that the Viltrumite Empire and the GDA had, without any coordination or intention, arrived at the same description of the same problem from opposite sides of the situation, which told him something important about how genuinely unprecedented the problem was. Above the cloud layer, 2 Viltrumites who were not Nolan Grayson watched the footage their ship's sensors had been compiling since they achieved orbital position. They were not scientists. They were not analysts. They were soldiers, specifically the kind of soldiers the Empire deployed when a situation required assessment by people who understood force rather than data, and they watched Omni-Man strikes land on the figure in the yellow jumpsuit with the professional attention of individuals whose careers had been built on understanding exactly what Viltrumite force was capable of producing in a target. What the footage showed was not possible within any framework either of them carried. Viltrumite warriors had faced enhanced humans before, creatures of extraordinary durability by human standards, biological anomalies, technologically augmented individuals, and every single one of them had a ceiling. You found the ceiling, you exceeded it, and the matter was resolved. What the figure in the yellow jumpsuit appeared to have was not a ceiling, or if it had one, Omni-Man had not found it yet, and Omni-Man was one of the most powerful Viltrumites alive. They exchanged a look that did not require words, and then sent a follow-up communication to the Empire that went into considerably more detail than the diplomatic message Cecil had intercepted. Down in the city, Nolan had found Mark again. Mark was sitting against the wall of a parking structure that had survived the morning's damage largely intact, and he was holding his side and watching his father pace, which was something Mark had genuinely never seen his father do before. Nolan Grayson did not pace. Nolan Grayson moved with purpose or he was still, and the thin line between those two states was something Mark had understood instinctively since childhood as a measure of his father's certainty about the situation at hand. The packing meant something was wrong with the certainty, and Mark, despite everything that had happened between them in the last several hours, despite the cracked ribs and the betrayal and the complete dismantling of everything he had believed about his father, found that watching Nolan pace was almost more disturbing than everything else combined. Saitama arrived from the north, still walking, still with his hands in his pockets. He had apparently investigated the sound that had drawn him away from the diplomatic contact and found it to be a structural collapse rather than an active threat, and had done something about the structural collapse in a way that the rescue workers on the scene would later describe to their supervisors in language that their supervisors would find difficult to include in official reports. He looked at Nolan packing and Mark sitting, and the general atmosphere of unresolved tension, and said that it seemed like the two of them probably needed to talk, and that he would wait over here while they did that because family situations were not really his area, but that if the Cape guy started hitting things again, he was going to have to ask him to stop again. Then he sat down on a parking barrier, pulled a slightly crushed receipt from his pocket, and began calculating whether the grocery trip had been financially worth the bus fare, given that the store was apparently still closed. Nolan stopped packing. He looked at Saitama with an expression that had moved over the course of the day, from dismissal through frustration through calculation, and had arrived somewhere that did not have a clean label, somewhere in the territory between professional respect and something that felt uncomfortably close to the thing Viltrumites were not supposed to feel about obstacles. He asked, for the first time directly, without the overlay of dominance or threat, who Saitama was, not what he was. Who? Saitama looked up from the receipt and said he was a hero for fun, which was technically the most accurate answer he could have given, and which landed in the silence of the parking structure like a stone dropped into very still water, sending ripples in every direction that none of the three people present were entirely prepared to follow to their conclusion. They came down at dawn, not dramatically, not with the theatrical descent that Nolan had used when he wanted humans to understand the scale of what they were dealing with, but practically, efficiently, the way soldiers land when they are not interested in spectacle and are only interested in outcomes. Two Viltrumites touched down in the center of what had been a public park on Chicago's north side, now a field of churned earth and broken trees from the previous day's collateral damage, and they stood in the early morning light with the particular stillness of people who have crossed the distance between star systems, and are not in any hurry because hurry implies the possibility of being too late, and nothing in their experience had ever happened too fast for them to handle. Their names were Lucan and Thraxa, and between them they had participated in the conquest of 11 planets and the suppression of 4 separate species-wide resistance movements, and they had been sent here not to complete Nolan's mission, but to assess why it was taking longer than projected and to determine whether the anomaly the ship's sensors had flagged required elimination or containment. Nolan met them in the park. The conversation was in Viltrumite, clipped and functional, the language of people who communicate in terms of objectives and outcomes rather than context or nuance. Lucan told Nolan that the Empire had reviewed the sensor footage. Nolan said the situation was under control. Thraxa said that the sensor footage did not support that assessment. Nolan said that the individual was anomalous but not a strategic threat, that his behavior was non-aggressive, and his apparent indifference to Viltrumite force did not translate into any kind of organized resistance. Lucan said that indifference to Viltrumite force was itself a strategic threat by definition, because the entire architecture of Viltrumite conquest depended on the universal applicability of that force, and something that the force did not apply to was not a minor anomaly. It was a structural problem. The conversation did not last long after that, because all three of them understood that the disagreement between Nolan's operational assessment and the Empire's strategic assessment was not going to be resolved through discussion. It was going to be resolved through contact, and Lucan and Thraxa were there to make that contact. Mark watched them from the edge of the park, still nursing his ribs, and pulled out the communicator Cecil had sent through the diplomatic contact the previous evening. He had not used it yet, because using it felt like a definitive choice about which side of everything he was on, and he had spent the night in a state of internal paralysis that his injuries had done nothing to help. But 2 more Viltrumites landing in a Chicago park at dawn felt like the kind of development that made internal paralysis a luxury he could no longer afford. He sent a single message to Cecil. 2 more just landed, park on north side. They're talking to my father. Cecil's response came back in under a minute and said, "We see them. Stay back. Do not engage. Where is the other one?" Saitama was at a food cart 2 blocks from the park. The cart operator had stayed through the emergency because the cart was his livelihood, and he had decided, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has built something small and does not intend to abandon it because large people are having large problems nearby, that he was going to keep serving breakfast. Saitama had found him and purchased 2 tamagotchi skewers, and was eating them with the focused appreciation of someone who has not had a proper meal in over 24 hours, and he was listening to the sounds coming from the park with one ear the way a person listens to a television in another room, aware of it, tracking the general shape of it, not yet engaged. The sounds from the park were not alarming to him yet. They were the sounds of people talking in a language he did not understand, which described a significant portion of his daily experience as a hero, and did not by itself require action. Lucan and Thraxa finished their conversation with Nolan, and turned toward the city with the synchronized purpose of soldiers beginning an assignment. Their assignment, as the Empire had defined it, was to locate and engage the anomaly directly, to determine through contact what the sensor footage had been unable to determine through observation, specifically whether the anomaly's resistance to Viltrumite force had an upper limit, and if so where that limit was. This was, in the cold strategic language of the Empire, a reconnaissance operation. In practical terms, it meant that 2 of the most combat-experienced Viltrumites outside the Empire's inner circle were about to hit Saitama as hard as they possibly could and observe the results, and the scientific detachment with which they approached this plan said everything necessary about what they expected those results to look like. They found him at the food cart. Lucan looked at him, the yellow jumpsuit, the relaxed posture, the skewer, and experienced the same cognitive dissonance that Nolan had experienced the previous morning, the gap between what the sensor data had shown and what was currently standing in front of him eating breakfast. Thraxa did not wait. She had reviewed the footage and had concluded that hesitation was what had allowed the first day to produce no resolution, and she crossed the distance between herself and Saitama in a fraction of a second, and hit him with a strike that she had previously used to shatter the hull plating of an armored transport vessel. The food cart operator dove behind his cart. The skewer went flying. Saitama turned to look at where the skewer had landed with an expression of genuine, specific disappointment that had nothing to do with the strike and everything to do with the tamagotchi. And then he turned back to Thraxa and told her, with the quiet, flat displeasure of someone who has been interrupted during the only good part of their day, that he had paid for that. Thraxa hit him 6 more times before she stopped. Not because she had decided to stop, and not because the results were encouraging, but because the 7th strike would have required her to reposition, and in the half-second it took her to do that she processed something that her combat instincts had been flagging since the 3rd impact, and she had been overriding because Viltrumite combat doctrine did not have a category for what they were flagging. The category they were flagging was, "This is not working, and continuing to do the same thing with more force is not a strategy, it is a panic response," and Thraxa had not survived 11 planetary conquests by panicking. She stepped back. She assessed. Saitama was standing in exactly the same place he had been standing when she started, with the same posture, the same expression, the same orientation toward where the skewer had landed, and the only evidence that anything physical had occurred between them was the fact that the pavement under his feet had cracked outward in a radial pattern from each impact point, which meant the force was going somewhere. It was transferring into the ground rather than into him, which was either a biological phenomenon or a physics phenomenon, and either way it implied something about his relationship to force that made Thrax's strategic instincts go very quiet and very focused. Lucan had not joined the engagement. He had watched. This was deliberate. One engages, one observes, and what he had observed was sufficient to generate a tactical picture that he was not enjoying. The individual's response to Thrax's strikes was not the response of someone absorbing damage and enduring it through extraordinary resilience. It was the response of someone who was not experiencing the strikes as meaningful input. There was a difference, and Lucan understood it because he had fought beings of extraordinary resilience before, and they all shared a common tell: the micro-expressions, the controlled breathing, the slight recalibration of stance after each impact that indicated a body managing incoming force. Saitama had none of those tells. His body was not managing incoming force. His body was simply not registering it as force in any sense that required management. And that distinction, small as it sounded, was the difference between an opponent with a very high ceiling and an opponent with no ceiling at all, and those were not the same problem. Mark arrived at the edge of the scene at a limping run, having ignored Cecil's instruction to stay back, because staying back, while two Viltrumites engaged an apparently invulnerable stranger, felt like the kind of decision he would spend a long time regretting. He stopped at the perimeter of the cracked pavement and watched Thraxa step back, and Lucan stand very still, and Saitama look at the spot where the skewer had landed, and then look at the two Viltrumites with the expression of someone who is deciding whether the situation has now crossed from mildly inconvenient into something that requires a more direct response. Mark had been watching Saitama for almost 30 hours at this point, and he had developed a tentative working theory about the man's behavioral patterns, which was that Saitama operated on a threshold system. Below the threshold, mild curiosity and conversational engagement. Above the threshold, something that Mark had not yet seen, but which he was increasingly certain the two Viltrumites in front of him were approaching. The skewer, he suspected, had been closer to the threshold than either Lucan or Thraxa understood. Saitama walked over, picked up the skewer, looked at it, and put it down again because it had landed in debris and was no longer viable. He straightened up, turned to face Lucan and Thraxa, and said that he was going to need one of them to explain what exactly they were trying to accomplish, because if they were testing something they could have just asked, and if they were trying to start a fight, they should understand that he was going to have to finish it, and finishing it was going to be very quick and probably not satisfying for anyone involved. The tone was not threatening. It was the tone of a person laying out practical information, so that the people receiving it could make an informed decision, and the practical information was delivered with such complete, unperformed certainty that Lucan, who had not moved since Thrax's engagement began, felt something shift in his strategic assessment of the situation in a direction he had not anticipated and did not welcome. Thraxa attacked again, not from panic and not from strategic calculation, but from something closer to refusal to accept the implication of what Lucan's assessment and her own experience were jointly producing, because accepting it required accepting a conclusion about the nature of Viltrumite superiority that her entire identity was built on not accepting. She came at Saitama with everything, the full committed force of a warrior who had broken planets, and Saitama sighed, the small specific sigh of someone who had hoped the conversation would go differently, and moved his arm in a short compact arc that connected with Thrax's midsection and produced a sound like the world briefly disagreeing with itself. Thraxa went through the parking structure behind her, not into it, through it. She exited the other side, crossed 200 meters of open air, and came to rest in the facade of an office building on the next block with a silence that was somehow louder than everything that had preceded it. She was alive. Viltrumite biology was not so easily ended, but she was not moving, and the particular way she was not moving communicated clearly that she would not be moving again for some time. Lucan stared at the hole in the parking structure. Then he looked at Saitama. Saitama was looking at his arm with mild academic interest, the way a person looks at a tool after using it to confirm it performed as expected. And then he looked at Lucan and said that he had warned her, and that he hoped she was not seriously hurt because he had pulled it. And the phrase "pulled it" landed in Lucan's processing like a stone into still water, because it implied that what had just sent a Viltrumite warrior through a concrete structure was the restrained version. And if that was the restrained version, then the unrestrained version was something Lucan had absolutely no framework to contain. He did the only tactically rational thing available to him. He went to get Nolan. Nolan listened to Lucan's report without interrupting. This was unusual. Nolan Grayson was not a patient listener in tactical contexts. He was someone who processed information quickly and began forming responses before the information was fully delivered, because, in his experience, the first 70% of any report contained everything actionable, and the remaining 30% was detail that could be absorbed in motion. But he let Lucan finish completely. Every word, every observation, every implication of the phrase "pulled it." And when Lucan was done, Nolan stood in the ruin park for a long moment and looked at the skyline in the direction of the parking structure, and did not speak. The silence lasted long enough that Lucan began to wonder if Nolan had heard him at all. And then Nolan said, quietly, in Viltrumite, that he had hit the individual at full force the previous morning, and had been receiving the same data ever since, and that he had been categorizing it as anomalous rather than structural, because categorizing it as structural required a conclusion he had not been ready to reach. The conclusion was this: Saitama was not durable in the way that Viltrumites were durable, or in the way that any enhanced being they had ever encountered was durable. Durability, as the Empire understood it, was a ceiling extraordinarily high in Viltrumite biology, measurable in the force required to breach it, but a ceiling nonetheless. What Saitama appeared to have was not a higher ceiling. He appeared to have a different relationship with force entirely, one in which incoming force and outgoing force operated on separate tracks that did not interact with each other the way they interacted in every other physical system the Empire had ever catalogued. He hit things with force that produced effects. Things hit him with force that produced no effects. These two facts coexisted in the same body without contradiction, and the reason that was structurally catastrophic for the Empire's position was that the entire logic of Viltrumite conquest, the reason species submitted, the reason planets fell, the reason the Empire had expanded across galaxies for centuries, was based on the universal principle that sufficient force overcame all resistance. If that principle had an exception, then the principle was not universal, and if it was not universal, then it was not the foundation Nolan had built his entire life on top of. It was just a thing that had worked so far. Cecil received Lucan's report secondhand, through surveillance audio that his team had been capturing since the Viltrumites landed, translated in near real time by the same system that had decoded the ship's communication. He read the translation at his desk with the kind of stillness that in another person might have looked like calm, but in Cecil looked like a man holding something very carefully, because he understood exactly how it would break if he dropped it. The Viltrumites had reached the same conclusion his analysts had been circling for 2 days, and hearing it articulated in Viltrumite tactical language, stripped of all the diplomatic hedging and classification uncertainty that had softened his own team's reports, made it feel different, more solid, more irreversible. He pulled up the communication line to the room that did not officially exist and began a new briefing, and this one he started differently than the last one. He started it by telling the 9 people on the line that the assessment had changed, that the unknown individual was no longer an anomaly requiring classification, and that what they were dealing with was an absolute upper limit on the concept of force as a tool of control, present in a single human body, wandering around Chicago looking for a grocery store, and that this fact had implications for every threat model, every defense architecture, and every assumption about the nature of power that any of them had ever operated under. Saitama, meanwhile, had returned to the food cart. The operator had emerged from behind his cart after the parking structure incident and had, with the admirable pragmatism of a small business owner, who has decided that extraordinary circumstances do not excuse him from the ordinary obligations of his profession, resumed service. Saitama had purchased a replacement skewer and was eating it with the quiet satisfaction of a situation finally resolving correctly. And he was thinking, not about Viltrumites or force ceilings or the structural implications of his existence, but about the grocery store and whether it was worth attempting again today or whether the emergency perimeter was still up. He had checked once that morning and been turned back by a National Guard checkpoint, and the soldier at the checkpoint had been very polite but very firm, and Saitama had respected that because the soldier was clearly doing his job, and it seemed unfair to make someone's job harder just because you wanted discounted produce. Nolan came to him, not Lucan, not Thraxa, Nolan, alone, walking across the debris field with his cape hanging still in the morning air, and the way he was walking was different from every other time he had moved through this city over the past 2 days. He was not moving with purpose toward an objective. He was moving toward a conversation, and the distinction was visible in every line of his posture to anyone who knew how to read it. Mark, watching from a distance, recognized it immediately and felt something complicated happen in his chest that was not quite hope and not quite fear but lived in the same neighborhood as both. Nolan stopped in front of Saitama and looked at him for a long moment and then asked the question that had been building since the first punch landed and produced nothing. He asked Saitama what he was, not who. What? The distinction was deliberate, and Nolan's voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what they were asking, and had decided that the answer, whatever it was something they needed to possess regardless of what it cost them to hear it. Saitama finished the skewer, handed the stick back to the cart operator, and thought about the question with the same mild sincerity he applied to most things. Then he said that he was not sure exactly, that he had trained very hard for a long time and one day he was just strong, and that he had been hoping someone would eventually come along who could give him a real fight because it had been a while since anything had been interesting. And he said this last part while looking directly at Nolan with an expression that was not challenging and not boastful, but simply honest. The honesty of someone describing a genuine problem they have been carrying for a long time. And Nolan Grayson, conqueror of worlds, instrument of the Viltrumite Empire, stood in the wreckage of a Chicago morning and understood for the first time in his life what it felt like to be on the other side of that expression. The ship came down, not the subtle, sensor-suppressed descent of the previous day, but a full, deliberate, visible entry that burned a streak across the morning sky from horizon to horizon and landed in Lake Michigan with a concussive displacement of water that sent a 2-meter wave rolling toward the shoreline. It was not an accident, and it was not impatience. It was a statement, the kind of statement that the Viltrumite Empire made when it had decided that subtlety had run its course, and that what the situation required now was the unmistakable weight of imperial presence. 3 more Viltrumites emerged from the water and crossed the remaining distance to the shore on foot, walking through the lake like it was a mild inconvenience, which to them it was, and they joined Lucan on the shoreline, and the 5 of them together represented more concentrated Viltrumite combat capability than had been deployed to a single planetary theater in over 60 years. The Empire was not sending a message anymore. The Empire was applying a solution. Cecil watched the ship's entry on 17 simultaneous feeds from orbital sensors, ground cameras, and 3 surveillance drones that had been repositioned overnight specifically to maintain visual coverage of the lakefront. He had been awake for 31 hours. His staff had been rotating in shifts, but he had not rotated because there was no one to rotate to. No one else in the building or outside it who had the full picture in their head in the specific configuration that allowed them to make the decisions that were going to need making in the next several hours. He watched 5 Viltrumites walk out of Lake Michigan and felt the weight of everything his contingency planning had never accounted for pressed down on him with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its completeness. He had planned for Omni-Man. He had not planned for the Empire deciding that Omni-Man's mission was taking too long and sending reinforcements, and he had not planned for those reinforcements arriving in a theater that already contained a variable that the Empire itself did not know how to account for. The interaction between those two unplanned elements was what was going to determine whether Chicago was the end of something or the beginning of something considerably worse, and Cecil did not yet know which direction it was going to fall. The 5 Viltrumites on the shore were joined by Nolan, who had broken away from his conversation with Saitama when the ship entered the atmosphere, and the 6 of them conferred in the clipped, efficient shorthand of soldiers who have worked together across campaigns and do not need to explain context to each other. The new arrivals had their orders directly from the Empire's command structure, and those orders were unambiguous. The anomaly was to be engaged at full combined force. The result was to be documented and transmitted, and based on that result, a final determination would be made about Earth's timeline. If the anomaly had a ceiling, find it, document it, and incorporate it into the operational plan. If the anomaly did not have a ceiling, the determination would be of a different kind, the kind that the Empire reserved for situations where a planet had produced something that could not be controlled and therefore could not be allowed to exist in a state of independence from imperial authority. The phrasing of that second determination was diplomatic, but its meaning was not, and every Viltrumite present understood it without requiring clarification. Mark intercepted the translation from Cecil's team on the communicator and read it standing in the shadow of a damaged transit shelter, and felt the specific, cold quality of fear that comes not from immediate danger, but from understanding clearly what is about to happen and being unable to identify any mechanism by which it can be prevented. He looked across the debris field to where Saitama was standing, still near the food cart, watching the Viltrumites assemble on the shore with the same mild, assessing attention he applied to everything, and Mark wanted to warn him, wanted to cross the distance, and explain what was coming with the full weight and urgency it deserved. But he could not find the mechanism for that either, because every time he had tried to apply urgency to Saitama's situation over the past 2 days, urgency had simply not taken hold, had slid off the surface of Saitama's attention the way force slid off the surface of his body, and Mark was not sure that knowing 6 Viltrumites were about to engage him simultaneously would produce a different result than knowing one was about to. They came at him in a formation that the Empire had developed over centuries specifically for targets that had proven resistant to individual engagement. It was not a complex formation. Complexity introduced coordination failures, but it was precise, timed to eliminate the possibility of sequential engagement by ensuring that all force arrived within a window too small for any known reaction time to exploit. Lucan led. The others followed in a spread pattern designed to eliminate lateral movement as an option. They crossed the distance between the shore and Saitama's position in just under 2 seconds, which was fast enough that the GDA's ground cameras only captured the beginning and end of the movement, and had to reconstruct the middle from the audio record. And the audio record of those 2 seconds contained a series of impacts that the acoustic analysts would later describe, in their official report, as sounding like a thunderstorm being compressed into the space of a heartbeat. Saitama did not move laterally. He stood in the same place he had been standing, and he let the formation arrive, and he turned in a short controlled circle with both arms extended at approximately chest height, and made contact with all 6 Viltrumites in a single rotation that lasted less than a second. The results were not uniform. Nolan went further than the others, possibly because he had been closest to the center of the arc. But the general outcome was that 6 of the most combat-capable beings in the known galaxy were distributed across a significant portion of downtown Chicago in various states of structural engagement with the buildings they had passed through. And Saitama completed his rotation, settled back into his usual posture, and stood in the resulting silence with an expression that had shifted, very slightly, from its habitual mild curiosity into something that was almost, not quite, but almost the shadow of satisfaction. The faint, quickly suppressed flicker of someone who has, for the first time in longer than they care to calculate, been required to do something that was not entirely routine. It did not last. By the time the dust from the nearest impact had begun to settle, the expression was gone, replaced by the familiar flatness, and Saitama looked around at the damage and the silence and the morning sky and said, mostly to himself, that it had still been a little easy, and the particular quality of disappointment in his voice was the most devastating thing that had happened in Chicago in 2 days. The Empire received the transmission from the ship's sensors 40 minutes after the engagement ended. It arrived at the central command relay in a compressed data package that contained full sensor records, acoustic analysis, structural damage mapping, and the biological status readouts of all 6 Viltrumites who had participated in the combined engagement. And the processing system that received it flagged it immediately for priority review, because 3 of the data fields contained values that the system's validation protocols had never encountered before, and therefore could not confirm as accurate. The values in question were the force output readings from the single rotation Saitama had used to engage all 6 simultaneously, which the ship's sensors had measured and recorded, and which the validation system kept rejecting as corrupted data, because the numbers were not physically possible within the framework the system had been built to assess. The system had been built to assess Viltrumite-level force. It was rejecting the readings because they exceeded the scale the system was designed to measure, the way a thermometer rejects a temperature that exceeds the range of its markings, not because the temperature isn't real, but because the instrument wasn't built for it. A Viltrumite commander named Craig reviewed the transmission personally after the automated system flagged it. Craig had been part of the Empire's strategic command for over 200 years and had reviewed engagement reports from campaigns across 40 star systems and had developed, over that time, a very precise sense of what data looked like when it was corrupted versus what it looked like when it was accurate and simply unprecedented. He reviewed the sensor records 3 times and concluded that the data was accurate. Then he sat with that conclusion for a period of time that his staff would later note was unusually long for a man known for rapid decision-making. And when he emerged from that period, he did not issue the order that his staff had been anticipating, the order that the Empire's standing protocols called for in situations where a planetary body had demonstrated the capacity to repel Imperial force. He issued a different order. He issued an order for a full strategic reassessment of Earth's operational status, which in Imperial language meant that the mission was being paused, not abandoned, not reclassified, but paused pending a review that would involve personnel and resources that had never previously been directed at a Class 4 pre-conquest planet, because Class 4 pre-conquest planets did not produce anomalies that broke the validation systems of Imperial sensor technology. On the ground in Chicago, the aftermath was quiet in the way that things are quiet after something very loud has finished. The 6 Viltrumites were alive. Viltrumite biology did not yield easily even to forces that exceeded its design parameters. But they were not combat capable, and the process of extracting them from the various structures they had become embedded in was going to take time and medical resources that were not currently present in the theater. Lucan had come to rest in the upper floors of a hotel 14 blocks from the engagement point, and was conscious but not mobile. Thraxa, who had already been through the parking structure the previous day, had ended up in the river and was being tracked by a GDA drone as she floated downstream in a state of enforced stillness that even her considerable recovery capacity was struggling to address on a compressed timeline. Nolan had gone the furthest. His impact point was in a suburb 20 kilometers northwest of the city center, and the crater it produced was going to require a geological survey before anyone could determine whether the underlying infrastructure was still sound. Mark reached Nolan's impact point in 40 minutes, pushing through the pain of his ribs with the focused determination of someone who has decided that whatever their relationship with this person is now, the question of whether that person is alive comes first. He found his father conscious, lying in the crater, staring at the sky with an expression that Mark had never seen on Nolan Grayson's face before and did not have a ready name for. It was not pain, though Nolan was clearly in significant pain. It was not defeat in the straightforward sense, not the expression of someone who has lost a contest. It was something more fundamental than that, the expression of someone whose understanding of the world has been revised at a level so deep that the revision has not yet finished propagating through all the places that understanding had been load-bearing. Nolan had built his sense of self on a hierarchy of strength that had been absolute and universal and confirmed by centuries of experience across the galaxy, and that hierarchy now had something above it that didn't know the hierarchy existed, and the weight of that was not a tactical problem. It was an existential one. Mark sat at the edge of the crater and did not say anything for a while, and Nolan did not say anything either, and the silence between them was different from the charged, violent silence of the previous day. It was a thinking silence, the kind that follows an event large enough to require completely new frameworks before it can be properly spoken about. Eventually Nolan said, without looking away from the sky, that he had told himself the Empire's way was the only way because the Empire had never met anything it couldn't overcome, and that he had built everything on that. His mission and his marriage and his understanding of what his son was supposed to become, and that a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit eating breakfast skewers had made all of that load-bearing structure feel, in the space of 2 days, like something he had constructed out of assumptions he had never thought to test. Mark did not have a response to that was adequate. He said, quietly, that they could figure out the rest later. Nolan closed his eyes. The sky above the crater was clear and blue and completely indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it. Cecil received confirmation of the Empire's strategic reassessment order from his translation team at noon, and read it at his desk with the careful, non-reactive attention of someone who understands that the thing in front of them is significant but is not yet ready to determine in which direction. A pause was not a withdrawal. The Empire had not left and had not abandoned its interest in Earth, and the situation on the ground remained deeply, genuinely unresolved in ways that a single engagement, however decisive, had not and could not fully address. But the pause meant something. It meant the Empire had encountered a variable it needed time to process, and time was the one resource that the Empire, in all its centuries of expansion, had always had in abundance and had never before needed to spend on a single planet. Saitama had not defeated the Viltrumite Empire. He had not tried to. He had not done anything in the strict intentional sense that could be described as a strategic action. He had eaten breakfast, asked about a grocery store, expressed mild concern for bystanders, and responded to physical provocations with the minimum force necessary to make them stop. And in doing so he had introduced into the Empire's strategic calculus a variable that the calculus did not have a place for and could not simply delete, and the Empire was going to have to rebuild part of its calculus before it could proceed, and rebuilding took time. And time was something Earth now had more of than it had had 2 days ago. Saitama found the grocery store open at 2 in the afternoon. The emergency perimeter had been partially lifted to allow supply vehicles through, and he had walked in through the same gap and filled a basket with the items on his list and paid at the register, and walked back out into the afternoon sun with his groceries in a bag over one shoulder. And the city around him was damaged and still and beginning, very slowly, to assess itself. He passed a news crew on the way back to the bus stop, and one of the journalists called out and asked who he was, and Saitama stopped and thought about it for a moment, because it was a reasonable question and deserved a reasonable answer. He said he was a hero from City Z, that he had been in the area, and that things seemed to be mostly sorted out now. Then he asked if the bus was still running, because he had a long way home and would prefer not to walk the whole distance. The journalist stared at him. Saitama waited. The bus, it turned out, was running. 3 weeks after Chicago, the world held a press conference that no government had officially called, and no single authority had organized, which meant it was less a press conference than a simultaneous, globally televised acknowledgement that something had happened which required public accounting. 7 heads of state appeared on separate feeds that were broadcast together, and they each said versions of the same thing in different languages with different levels of diplomatic packaging. And what they all said, stripped of the packaging, was that the planet had been in danger, that the danger had been addressed, and that the nature of the addressing had raised questions that existing frameworks were not equipped to answer. They did not name Saitama. They did not name Omni-Man. The classified briefings that had informed their statements used both names extensively, but the public statements used phrases like unregistered enhanced individuals and non-state actors of unknown classification, because the actual names and the actual facts of what had happened in Chicago were, in the considered judgment of everyone who had reviewed the full footage, information that the global public was not yet structurally prepared to receive in a single dose. Cecil disagreed with this approach privately and implemented it publicly, because disagreeing with it publicly would have required explaining why, and explaining why would have required disclosing more of what he knew than the 7 heads of state had authorized him to disclose. And Cecil Stedman had been in this business long enough to understand that the gap between what he knew and what he was authorized to say was not an obstacle to his work. It was the medium in which his work existed. He spent the 3 weeks after Chicago rebuilding. Not rebuilding Chicago, though that was happening, and not rebuilding the GDA's operational capacity, though that was happening too. He was rebuilding his threat model, starting from first principles, because the threat model he had maintained for the past decade had been built on a foundation that Chicago had revealed to be incomplete. The foundation had assumed that force was the ultimate currency of power, that every conflict at its base resolved into a question of who could apply more of it, and that the GDA's function was to ensure that the answer to that question, when it mattered, was on the right side. Chicago had introduced a being for whom force was not a currency because force did not apply to him the way it applied to everything else, and a being for whom force was not a currency existed outside every power structure that force underpinned, which was all of them, which meant Saitama was not inside any of the frameworks Cecil used to understand the world. And Cecil was going to have to build a new framework, or accept that this particular element of reality was simply going to remain outside his capacity to manage. He accepted it. This was not a comfortable acceptance, and it was not a quick one, but it was genuine, because Cecil Stedman was above all else a realist, and realism sometimes required acknowledging that the territory did not match the map, and that the correct response was to redraw the map rather than insist the territory was wrong. Saitama was outside his framework. Saitama was going to remain outside his framework. The most operationally useful thing Cecil could do with that fact was make sure that Saitama's outside the framework status did not become a problem, which meant not attempting to control or classify or deploy him, because all of those attempts would fail and failure had costs, and the costs of failing to control something that had just sent 6 Viltrumites through Chicago's architectural inventory were costs Cecil was not willing to absorb. Nolan Grayson did not leave Earth. This surprised some people who knew his full history and assumed that the collapse of his mission would produce either a departure or a final, desperate attempt to complete it, but Nolan did neither. He stayed, and the reason he stayed was Mark. And the reason Mark was the reason was something that had shifted in the crater outside Chicago when Nolan lay on his back looking at a sky that had no interest in his mission or his failure and said out loud, for the first time in decades, something that was true without also being strategic. He had told Cecil, through Mark, that he would cooperate with whatever process the GDA needed to conduct, and Cecil had spent 2 weeks deciding what he wanted that process to look like, before concluding that what he actually wanted was less a process than a result. And the result he wanted was Nolan Grayson's knowledge of the Viltrumite Empire's structure, capabilities, and strategic calendar, transferred as completely as possible into GDA files. In exchange for a set of considerations regarding Nolan's continued presence on Earth that Cecil outlined in a document that took 4 lawyers and 2 days to draft, and that Mark read 3 times before signing as a witness. It was not justice. It was not absolution. It was the specific kind of imperfect, pragmatic arrangement that the world produced when the people involved were too complicated for simple outcomes and too consequential to be handled with simple frameworks. The Empire did not return in those 3 weeks. This was not because they had abandoned Earth, and everyone who understood the situation understood that clearly Craig's strategic reassessment was ongoing, and its conclusion was not yet determined, and the pause was a pause, not a withdrawal. But the pause was real and its cause was real, and the cause was not a weapon system or a political negotiation or a military deterrent. The cause was a man in a yellow jumpsuit who had wandered into a catastrophe looking for discounted groceries and had, through the simple fact of his presence and the simple application of his most basic capability, introduced into the Empire's strategic calculus an uncertainty that centuries of conquest had never previously produced. The Empire would return eventually with new plans and new assessments and new determinations about what Earth represented and what it was worth and what to do about the thing living on it that their force could not touch. But eventually was not now, and now was what the planet had to work with, and now was, for the first time in a long time, sufficient. Mark found Saitama at a Hero Association event in City Z 6 weeks after Chicago. He had been looking for him for 2 weeks through channels that kept producing the same answer, which was that Saitama was registered as a B-class hero with a perfect efficiency record and 0 commendations, because the association's commendation system required witnesses who filed formal reports, and Saitama's resolutions tended to happen before witnesses had time to file anything. Mark had finally located him through the association's event calendar, which listed a regional hero mixer that Saitama had apparently registered for because it included a free buffet. Mark arrived at the event, found Saitama at the buffet with a plate stacked in a way that suggested serious intent, and stood next to him for a moment before saying that he wanted to thank him for what happened in Chicago. Saitama looked at him, clearly trying to place the face, and then nodded with the recognition of someone who has encountered this person in a specific context and is reassembling the context from memory. He said that the ribs looked better. Mark said they were. Then he asked Saitama if he had known, at any point during the 2 days, how serious it was, how close everything had come to going irreversibly wrong. Saitama thought about this with genuine consideration, the honest consideration of someone who does not perform depth they don't have, and said that it had seemed like a problem that needed sorting out, and that things that needed sorting out were generally his department. Mark looked at him for a long moment and then laughed, not from anything being funny exactly, but from the specific relief of a tension that had been held for 6 weeks finally finding somewhere to go. The world did not go back to what it had been. This was not stated in any official communication, and was not the subject of any press conference, but it was understood, in the specific wordless way that genuinely transformative events are understood, not as a policy or a declaration, but as a permanent change in the texture of reality that everyone who had been paying attention now carried with them. The Viltrumite Empire knew Earth had something that their force could not resolve. The GDA knew that its frameworks had edges that the world could exceed. Every government that had received the classified briefing knew that the hierarchy of power they had organized their security thinking around had a gap in it the size of a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit who was currently eating buffet food at a regional hero mixer in City Z, and thinking, with mild but persistent hope, that maybe next time something would come along that was actually worth getting excited about. That hope was the most dangerous thing on the planet, and the most human, and the most true, and it belonged entirely to someone who had no idea that the thing he had done in Chicago would be studied and argued about and quietly feared for the next 100 years by beings who had conquered galaxies and who now, for the first time in their long and certain history, were not entirely sure what to do next. Saitama finished the buffet. He checked the time, decided the bus would still be running, picked up his jacket from the chair where he had left it, and walked out into the evening, unremarkable and unmistakable, already thinking about what was on television tonight. You just watched an empire blink. If you think the Viltrumites are done with Earth, or that Saitama is done surprising everyone who underestimates what ordinary looks like, subscribe now, because the next story starts where this one left you, uncertain and wanting more.